This is the Financial Intelligence Podcast, brought to you by the UK Financial Intelligence Unit. The UK FIU has a national remit to analyse information on economic crime received through suspicious activity reports. All views expressed by panellists on the podcast are their own and not necessarily those of the UK FIU. Welcome to today's episode. My name is Emma Jane Turner and I am a manager in the UK FIU's reporter engagement team. Today's podcast covers a really difficult but really important topic, the live streaming of sexual abuse of children, which is also referred to as CSA or child sexual abuse live streaming. A bit of a warning, this episode covers and contains descriptions of child sexual offences that listeners may find upsetting. Please check the podcast notes for more information and guidance on how to seek help and advice. We are recording today from the NCA's London office, and I am joined by a panel of experts, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you now.
Thanks, EJ. So I'm Hardeep Walker. I'm the Deputy Head of the Child Sexual Abuse Threat in the NCA. I have over 20 years of experience in safeguarding and protecting children from harm, and I've worked within the NCA for the last 8 years, focused on areas such as human trafficking and modern slavery, organised immigration crime, and then more recently, the online abuse of children. And one of the areas that I particularly lead on is the live streaming of child sexual abuse, with a particular focus on working together with industry to detect and prevent abuse of children.
Hi, I'm George Xanaris. I'm the Financial Crime Threat Intelligence Lead at NatWest Group. I've previously worked at the Metropolitan Police Service for 14 years, which included a significant child sexual abuse investigation. I now lead a team at NatWest and we focus on identifying and mitigating key financial crime threats. And I've been in my current role for around 7 years now. And our team at NatWest proactively analyse emerging typologies across customers, products and services. What we try and do is leverage internal insights and intelligence from our public-private partnerships that we're involved in. And I'm also the co-chair of the CSA Livestreaming Gimlet Cell in partnership with Hardeep.
Thank you both, and thank you for joining me here today to talk about this really important topic. So first of all, the definition of child sexual abuse live streaming or CSA live streaming. The Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, have recently published a report titled Detecting, Disrupting and Investigating Online Child Sexual Exploitation. And in it, they define live-streamed sexual abuse of children as a cyber-enabled crime that covers a range of offences, including sexual exploitation and human trafficking. The report notes that the crime involves individuals in the roles of facilitator, abuser and consumer, arranging the sexual abuse of a child victim. This includes forcing them to engage in sexual activity in front of a webcam or camera device. The facilitator and the abuser are often the same person, and they arrange and conduct the abuse in exchange for a financial payment from the consumer. So Hardeep, can you talk us through the nature of this threat and some of the particular challenges law enforcement faces when trying to combat it?
Thanks, EJ. So at the NCA, we estimate there's between 1.3 to 1.6% of the adult population that poses varying degree of risk to children. And this is a significant statistic, and it shows how widespread abuse can be. Now, the live streaming of sexual abuse of a child in exchange for financial payment is a major threat and causes serious long-term harm to children. As you say, the victim is often abroad and the consumer is based in the UK, and will engage with a local facilitator, providing payment for them to carry out or arrange the abuse. The UK is one of the highest global consumers of live streaming sexual abuse of children, and this often takes place in the Philippines. The offender relies on platforms using end-to-end encryption, which helps them to avoid detection and makes identifying the offender and gathering evidence much harder for law enforcement. The international nature of the crime also means that international cooperation and collaboration is crucial in safeguarding victims and gathering evidence to prosecute offenders as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Hardeep. There's some really harrowing statistics there which show the importance of the work law enforcement and the private sector are doing in this space, which we're going to talk a little bit more about shortly. But before we do, I want to hear more about how the NCA is tackling the live streaming threat and working with other law enforcement agencies globally to do so. Hardeep, can you talk us through this as well?
Absolutely. So we use all the tools at our disposal, working together with partners, innovatively and creatively, to gain understanding of the methods that offenders are using. And this includes working overseas with partners with a primary focus of protecting and safeguarding vulnerable children, while gathering the best evidence possible to convict UK offenders and bring them to justice. And we use all of this knowledge and experience to inform industry so that they better understand what live streaming looks like and what those transactions might be for the financial sector. We have an international liaison network of officers around the world who work side by side to share intelligence, develop operations, and arrest suspects and safeguard children. And a key strategic location, as I mentioned earlier, is the Philippines. Here, we've done a lot of work in the region focused on combating live streaming. And we work really closely with the Philippines law enforcement to have the greatest impact. So we're working together to ensure we can provide capabilities such as training or mentoring. And we also engage with a range of forums globally in the law enforcement community to create solutions and prevent and have early intervention processes in place to stop live streaming and wider child sexual abuse, learning from each other and developing as we go.
That's great. It sounds like there's some really, really great work happening between those organisations. So, George, I'm going to come to you now. You're obviously joining us from NatWest, and understandably, given the financial element of this crime, where consumers are paying for access to this content, financial institutions no doubt play a role or have a role to play in combating this high harm crime. Can you give us some insights into what NatWest and the wider industry are doing to identify customers who may be involved in this type of offending?
Yeah, of course. So despite the severity of this horrible threat, financial institutions reporting suspicious activity is disproportionately low, which suggests that we've got limited detection methods. So traditional financial institutions like ourselves at NatWest take quite a proactive approach to identifying threats in the modern day. And we use indicators that we've established through open source intelligence. We use reputable publications, internal investigations. And when you look at all those things collectively, they can create quite a lot of suspicion, and then we're able to report. We do a lot of education work as well, using different techniques within the industry as well to educate staff on what to look for, red flags, etc. And we've had some success of this approach at NatWest and other banks as well. But the problem that we have is there's lots of high volumes of false positives, and that takes a significant amount of time to manually review. The industry has been grappling with this for some time, and some of the listeners may be aware that in 2020, Austrac fined Westpac, a bank, $1.3 billion for AML breaches. And one of the findings in that fine was that there was a failure to detect transactions linked to CSA. So for me, it's really important that you have a much broader intelligence sharing, and the law enforcement intelligence is crucial. And we need to think about innovative ways of looking at the threat from a cross-sector perspective, using global collaboration, and that intel sharing is absolutely essential.
Thanks for that, George. So it sounds like there's also some great things happening in the private sector as well, but still work to do and still progress to make in order to address this, as you say, high harm threat. So we've heard about what law enforcement is doing in this space, and we've been given some insights into what financial institutions are doing. So now I want to turn to how the NCA and the financial sector are working together to increase awareness and knowledge of the financial footprint of CSA live streaming in order to disrupt it, reduce and deter UK consumers, and to provide actionable leads through innovative partnership work to more effectively tackle the live streaming of CSA. So George, I'm going to come to you first. Why do you think it's so important for law enforcement and financial institutions to work together to fight this type of crime? And what can this type of partnership bring to these investigations?
Well, the financial footprint's absolutely crucial, especially when you're looking at consumers interacting with facilitators. That's one of the key elements of CSA. And using that up-to-date law enforcement intelligence on recent cases helps us really look at the behaviours and the trends of how some of these facilitators and consumers are interacting with the different parts of the financial industry. So when we use the learnings of those investigations, it helps us as banks inform the tools that we use to proactively mitigate the threats, and it helps us supplement that awareness piece that I mentioned earlier to help different people within the industry identify the threats. And I think the data that you see across the industry can differ. So if you look at a traditional financial institution like ourselves, what we see will be quite different to what a money service business may see, or a payment service provider, or a crypto firm. So it's really important that we come together as a collective so we can really understand the whole picture. And understanding the threats in that sort of collaborative environment can help lead to more relevant intelligence for law enforcement, and to give them some leads into new investigations and safeguarding action as well. So for me, that's a real crucial partnership.
Great, thanks for that, George. Some really important insights there into how organisations can work together with law enforcement to combat this threat. So Hardy, George has highlighted some of the crucial ways financial institutions can support investigations into offenders who are involved in the live streaming of child sexual abuse. But what is the NCA doing to ensure financial institutions have the information they need to proactively identify live streaming offenders in their customer base?
So the NCA recognised the relationship with the financial sector is extremely important. Our collaboration will enable better identification of those consumers of live streaming of children being sexually abused. So what we've done so far is have a bit of a collaborative approach, working with the sector, sharing information on patterns of behaviour and our knowledge and expertise around live streaming offenders and facilitators. And by sharing this information, what we found is that banks and wider institutions can use that to start to wash those patterns or indicators across their systems and identify customers that may be of concern. And then they enrich that with their own research and development that they might be doing. And that will provide those indicators or those individuals that are likely to be engaging in this awful behaviour. And what we found so far is by doing this and sharing information and knowledge, we've had 2 major banks so far identify cases of customers which they have been able to report and submit to the NCA, which we have then progressed into investigations or development of intelligence. And this just demonstrates that this relationship and this collaboration will give us some fruitful kind of results in terms of identifying these cases, stopping children being abused at the earliest opportunity. And so we want to build on that and develop it further. And to enable this, we are continuing to develop clear, kind of in-depth, high-quality indicators to help the sector to better identify those cases. And this is kind of a journey we're on, and George and I are working together along with kind of members of a group to develop this, use all of our collective knowledge and skills to enable us to have kind of an enriched set of indicators. And what we're hoping to do later in the year is provide an Amber Alert that we will share with colleagues so that we can give them further ability to detect, identify, report and prevention opportunities, hopefully, to stop this kind of abhorrent crime.
And while financial institutions wait for that Amber Alert, which sounds like something that will be really welcomed in the sector, so while they're waiting for it to be published, can we share any general indicators of transactions relating to the live streaming offences that they can start to look out for?
Absolutely, EJ. There's enough knowledge from, for example, the FATF report that you referred to at the start of this conversation. And I would encourage colleagues, if they haven't read it already, please do have a read. There's some really useful information in there, particularly if you perhaps have not looked at this particular crime type before in your institutions. It's really worth a read. And I'll pull out just a couple of those that are worth knowing. and perhaps set this apart from other offending. So where there's payment of from an individual, perhaps from the UK, to another jurisdiction, and where there's no apparent legitimate connection, so there's no familial connection, or it's kind of out of the blue, if you like, then that should be of concern. Where there's transactions that are made kind of out of usual kind of daytime hours, if you like, for the UK, so late night, early morning, might suggest that the consumer is in a different location or time zone to the facilitator and the child being abused. Also, where there's unusual transaction references, either perhaps sexualized or kind of linked to social media profiles, or even sometimes we've found references to helping individuals kind of medical bills or school equipment, etc. Those things kind of stand out also, and we've seen that as a bit of a pattern. I'll just hand over to George to perhaps talk about those indicators that might be specifically relevant to financial institutions.
As we heard, the UK has a lot of consumers, unfortunately, and some of the indicators that you see there are the transactions being conducted by those consumers, and often it's when they're purchasing that live streamed content. But some of the things that you might see are purchases on things like adult service websites or dating sites that are linked to higher risk jurisdictions, where you might see the jurisdictions where people are actually being abused, the children are being abused. And there's also things like webcam services, live streaming. We've seen things like online gaming platforms and some of those platforms that provide adult entertainment as well. And one of the other things we've seen are things like purchases of video capture software as well. So the transactions are often linked to sometimes individuals that have actually been charged with child sexual exploitation related offences. And we might see that in adverse media reporting, and that could help us see other networks as well, potentially. So, yeah, there's quite a lot of transactions there, and there's a lot more we could talk about, but they're probably some of the key ones.
And also, what you might see is a number of small amounts being transferred kind of frequently in a short space of time. So often kind of from cases that we've looked at, there will be as little as kind of £12 being paid for the abuse of a child. And it really is kind of smaller amounts, but over perhaps a short period.
So we've heard quite a bit about these different indicators, and some of which are in that FATF report. But when you look at them in isolation, they're not particularly suspicious. And that's why it's really important that when you bring them all together, a combination of those indicators and other relevant factors may point to this type of offending. And as a financial institution, we have to really consider the static customer data that we hold. So things like the age, sometimes the occupation, if you can get that sort of information recorded, as well as those transactional indicators we've just talked about. When you look at those in combination with those transactions, we need to ask ourselves, do those transactional patterns actually align with what we'd expect from that customer, in terms of their age and occupation? And we may also want to consider if they are in an occupation which may give them access to children that may be vulnerable. So there's quite a few areas there you have to consider when you're looking at the transactions.
Great, thanks both. So we've heard about the indicators that financial institutions can look out for. Hadi, can you talk us through a recent case where some of these indicators have led to an outcome?
Yeah, sure. So towards the end of last year, there was a recent conviction of an individual who was identified through international law enforcement collaboration, actually working really closely with our partners overseas, and following the arrest of a facilitator. Through that, this consumer was identified, 38-year-old male in the UK, who'd been spending, it wasn't large sums of money, but it was a frequent sums over a couple of years, accessing child sexual abuse, the live streaming of child sexual abuse overseas in the Philippines. And there was no previous convictions for this individual, so nothing to suggest this individual may have been involved in child abuse. But once we identified that, we engaged with the financial sector And actually, some of what this financial sector provided was absolutely crucial, engaging with different institutions who saw kind of different parts of the picture, if you like, to enable us to secure a conviction for this individual. And he had been directing the sexual abuse of children from as young as 3-year-old child. And these victims gave a witness testimony during the conviction and really kind of were able to convey the horrific harm and damage caused to these children. And this individual received a 17-year imprisonment as well as kind of other sexual harm prevention orders, etc. And it was a really good outcome given kind of the impact and the harm he'd caused to children. And it wasn't possible to do this without the financial institutions' support and help. So a good outcome from kind of an awful situation, really. So I think it's just important to note that, or perhaps think about the moral obligation on all of us to do our utmost to try and protect children. I have children. There might be people listening to this podcast who have children also. And, collectively, we can do so much more by making sure we have taken the steps to protect children and identify those customers that may be offending and abusing children.
Yeah, absolutely. A really good example of what can be achieved when the private sector and law enforcement can work together and share that information to combat and address this high harm crime. So finally, we're about to draw to a close, but financial institutions and our other listeners are no doubt interested in how they can report suspected offenders or victims of child sexual abuse, live streaming, or any suspected sexual abuse or exploitation of children. And currently there are a number of avenues to do this. Your local police force is always a good place to start. If a child is in immediate danger, call 999 and ask for the police. If there is no immediate danger, you can report through 101 or anonymously through Crime Stoppers. There's also CEOP, the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Command within the National Crime Agency. CEOP accepts online reports from both adults and young people who are worried about online sexual abuse or the way someone has been communicating with a child online. And finally, there's NCMEC, the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, which has a cyber tip line for reporting child sexual exploitation and can take referrals from individuals and organisations globally. And also, if you are a regulated entity under the UK money laundering regulations, you should consider your obligations to report knowledge and suspicions of money laundering to the UK FIU. However, reporters are reminded that SARs are not crime reports. Therefore, SARs cannot be used to report the crime of purchasing CSA material or involvement in the live streaming of child sexual abuse. And that brings us to the end of our episode today. I want to thank both of our panellists for joining us here. A reminder that if you've been affected by any of the content discussed today, please look in the podcast notes for advice and guidance of where you can seek some support. And remember to keep up to date with our latest podcasts, magazines, and other UK FIU guidance products. Please follow the UK FIU's X or LinkedIn pages. You can also find our full collection of podcasts on Spotify and other major streaming platforms. So thank you for listening. I am Emma Jane Turner, and this is the UK FIU podcast.